I'm Adam Alexander. The motorsports world lost an icon today. Longtime writer and broadcaster Chris Economaki has died. Best known as the publisher of National Speed Sport News, he was one of the most influential voices in racing. In tribute, Speed Now presents a wind tunnel special report from 2006, Economaki, Eyewitness to American Racing History.
He was only 10 when the roar of racing engines lured him to the track. He needed a way in. This newspaper was his pit pass. 1934, 72 years ago. The Depression shaped the sport. The newsboy took it all in. He met the stars, wrote their stories, took their pictures, worked on their cars. He thumbed his way to far-flung speedways, learning new skills, new ways to communicate his passion for racing. As he made friends and influenced people, his face became familiar far beyond his beloved paper. Racing was going places, and Chris Economaki was there every step of the way. Eyewitness to American racing history. Tonight, he'll tell his story.
This special edition of Wind Tunnel with Dave Despain is presented by CarQuest.
Hi, I'm Dave Despain. Welcome to a special edition of Wind Tunnel presented by CarQuest. Now, there aren't many people in this racing world to whom we would dedicate an entire hour. Chris Economaki is one of those few. Think about it. For anybody to have worked a job for 72 years is pretty amazing. When that job is covering racing, covering it in print in the pages of National Speed Sport News, calling the action for the grandstand crowds as one of the most colorful track announcers ever, or analyzing it on the tube since the earliest days of televised racing. Well, suffice to say that anybody who's done all that is pretty special in our opinion, but I don't expect you to take my word for that.
Chris Economaki wrote the book on what we do.
He could take the average fairgrounds in America and turn it into a place of magic for 2 or 3 hours.
There are still some reporters who will ask the tough questions, but Chris had a way of doing it, that he did it with style. It became sort of his trademark.
Chris is a really interesting character. He is a genuine certified personality. In a world where so many people seem to be made of jello, he's made of really interesting material. He says interesting things. He has lived an extraordinary life.
Even a guy who's won 50 next-up cup races sort of looks at Chris and says, man, that guy's done a lot.
It's fascinating to me that I'll bring up a topic to Chris and he'll tell me all about it because he was there.
There's probably no human being in the United States that has a passion for motorsports like Chris does.
He's a true icon in the sport of motor racing, not to be ever be emulated.
High praise for a man I've wanted to interview for a long time. Tonight I get the chance. I'm fired up. How about Chris?
Have you had time to get ready? Are you prepared?
I am always prepared. I don't waste any time getting ready. I stay ready.
When we return, a delightful trip through 7 decades of racing history and surely at least one Economaki impression.
Tony. Wind Tunnel with Dave Despain is presented by the 3,400 CarQuest Auto Parts stores across North America. CarQuest, the professional choice. And brought to you in part by Edelbrock. Proven performance. Get it at edelbrock.com.
Visit GoRVing.com.
Chris Economaki, a 10-year-old New Jersey kid, heard the engines at Hohokus Speedway and ran down to check it out. They wouldn't let him in. 3 years later, at age 13, he made his first money from the sport, and he's been covering it ever since.
How did you get interested in racing? What lit you up about racing? You were just a little kid.
Well, of course, the basic precepts of racing, danger and speed and so forth. And those are the things that attracted everybody in the early days, and to this day, a number of people as well. And of course, both of those factors are being minimized. NASCAR keeps talking about safer barriers and safer walls, and I say to myself, well, that's fine, but they should shut up about it. because it takes away the allure of the sport.
Danger is part of what people buy a ticket to see or to experience.
No question about it. Yeah. Here, drivers facing death at every turn at the fair races this Saturday. Come buy a ticket. Sure, that sells tickets. It's part of the sport. It's inherent to the sport.
The politically correct would say, oh, that's the old days. We've all grown past that now. We don't think that way. We don't go to see people get hurt.
Well, I don't know how many people are politically correct these days. People don't come to the races to see people get hurt. They come to the races to be excited and to see people escape injury in spectacular crashes. That's my feeling.
No change from the way it was when you started, when you were a little
Well, the change, of course, is the product. You know, faster, speed, more speed. The loudest applause I ever heard was at Indianapolis during practice when Tom Carnegie would say, and it's a new track record. And the roof would come off the grandstand. Couldn't tell how fast the car was going. Nobody knows, but they were present when a speed record was set. Talk about it at dinner and so forth. Because we'll never hear that again. We will never, ever, at an auto race, hear that's a new track record. The worst thing that's happened to American auto racing, worldwide auto racing, has been this influx of high technology. Because what that did, in addition to making the cars too fast, has made them too expensive for the sport to sustain.
And out of the reach of the average guy with a toolbox. You have
Well,
to be an
that's
engineer.
true. You know,
right?
the American racing car historically was homemade. The car owner's investment in his car was time and effort and a few bucks for some parts. Johnny Gerber came east with two cars in the early 30s. He had made a cylinder head himself for the Chevrolet. He's a farmer from Iowa, and he didn't like it, so he was a single overhead cam head. He made a double overhead cam himself in his barn in Iowa, and it blew everybody off. It had huge valves, I remember. To me, it was intriguing. And then technology arrives, and this part that he used to make, he can't make anymore. He has to buy. And from whom does he buy it? Some aerospace company that's used to dealing with the government. Carbon fiber, Kevlar, space-age materials, and the cost is exorbitant. It's an incredible transition in this sport we're in.
Ekonomaki's opinions are grounded in history and experience, and that has a lot to do with a happy geographic coincidence. For that story, we visit the Patterson Museum in New Jersey.
Chris, if I say Gasoline Alley to most people, they're going to think Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
That's
when
right.
I say Gasoline Alley to you, you say, oh no, Patterson, New Jersey.
All right,
Tell me about this.
Here's part of it. The garages you see there, the western end of the original Gasoline Alley in the east, and this is Ted Horn and his Offenhauser engine car. Horn was a big name in American racing before the war, won a lot of races, and got Patterson a lot of publicity for being headquartered here. And he was killed in 1948, and though a Californian, he's buried close by here in Patterson, his adopted hometown.
How did Patterson come to have a gasoline alley?
Well, when the fair season, the agricultural fair season started, when there was a lot of races, drivers would come with their cars from all over the country and needed a place to headquarter.
Oh, okay.
And Patterson was centrally located and racing oriented.
Add one more happy coincidence. Chris's immediate neighborhood was also home to the newspaper, now synonymous with his name.
It's interesting to me that your life and the life of National Speed Sport News are essentially...
That's the first time you've mentioned it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm surprised you let me go this long without it. They're essentially one, or at least parallel.
Yeah.
You sold the first copy of the paper, is that accurate?
The first standalone issue in August of 1934, I sold, yes, as a newsboy.
Standalone issue, meaning that there had been some form of that paper
previously. The first indication of the newspaper was it appeared as a back page feature on a small-town weekly newspaper in East Paterson, New Jersey, called the Bergen Herald, and it had this auto racing page.
Why?
Because of all the cars that were garaged there during the fair season in the neighborhood, and people, these visitors from the Midwest and the South, and who belonged to the race crews, were living in furnished rooms in East Paterson. And one of the local mechanics said to the paper, "Why don't you publish racing news? All these people are here renting rooms from your homes, and they might like to see what's going on." And that was the beginning of the racing section, as it was called. And then as it blossomed and grew and encroached upon the school board news and what the mayor was doing in East Paterson, the residents complained, so they separated the racing section out into a tabloid, the form that it enjoys today.
Called National Speed Sport News.
Exactly.
You're welcome.
Loud and clear. And it was printed in Ridgewood, New Jersey, where I grew up. And I happened to walk by the Ridgewood News, which had a very large picture window. You could see the press there, and on the press, about to be printed, was the first tabloid issue of National Speed Sport News, which was August 16th, 1934. And I went in and got 200 copies, which I sold at the races that weekend for 5 cents a piece and made a penny. And I had made $2 in August of 1934, which was, the Depression was still very much in effect. And it was a significant sum of money, particularly for a 13-year-old.
Over time, that entrepreneurial kid had the opportunity to invest in his beloved paper. Today, he and his family own it. And so for more than 3 generations, National Speed Sport News has delivered to the fans and to the movers and shakers of the sport Ekonomaki's perspective, his passion, his opinions, and his weekly column.
As a young driver, I always felt that unless Chris Ekonomaki noticed you, you weren't going to go anywhere.
The editor's notebook, I mean, is just required reading for if you're involved in motorsport. And it was just phenomenal, the amount of information that he would have about all forms of sport and the industry. And it's you know, people would clamor to get their names mentioned in there.
But the thing that Chris Ekonomaki, even to this day with his column in National Speed Sport News, has an incredible ability to do, is to get inside the sport. And whether you're an insider or just a casual observer, give you a tidbit for you to munch on and enjoy.
Chris's columns aren't about motors and parts and sway bars and track bars. It's about people. It's about the people who make the sport. Chris is a storyteller. Chris is a legend maker.
I still read his column weekly and religiously because I always learn something. And that's, we don't have to do any research. He does it. And again, I just, he has to keep working forever. Otherwise, we just can't deal with it.
When we come back, Ekonomaki's view of the nationwide explosion in the 1930s of midget racing.
Unequivocally the most important development in American motorsport, without question. Nobody could challenge that.
Hey, ever at Furniture Row, a Tempur-Pedic elite retailer.
People oftentimes break history down by decade. I suspect that's not a great way to break down the history of American auto racing. It seems to me that perhaps there are eras. Yes, no?
The Board Speedway era, I think, was an incredible era in American automobile racing. There were 2 guys, Art Pillsbury and Jack Prince, who designed and built the tracks. Not only did they build racetracks, they had to survey the country for sections where they could get businessmen who would agree to pay for the track. That's why the board speedways are located in such disparate places, because they found somebody there that was willing to pay to build a track. The first board speedway, and this is very interesting, it's built in 1910 in Playa del Rey, California. The guys with the car say, you know, folding the windshield back and taking off the spare tires, not the way to do. We need a special car for this place. So the first racing car was built, thanks to the Board Speedway, the very first Board Speedway. So the Board Speedways were really significant in the advancement of auto racing in this country.
Significant but short-lived, board tracks quickly gave way to a new phenomenon, midget racing. And that gets Chris excited.
I think I'm right that you've been quoted as saying that the midget was the most important. You tell me, what is the midget's place in auto racing history?
Unequivocally the most important development in American motorsport, without question. Nobody could challenge that.
Why?
Well, because the auto race...
People today think of midgets as these sort of odd little cars that run here and there.
Oh, that's right. They're no longer the big thing they once were. But in the stepladder to a popularity of auto racing in the United States, the midgets are the #1 thing. An auto racetrack was always a half a mile or larger. Many of them took a lot of ground, a lot of property, and they were out someplace. And the auto race required travel to get to, and in many cases the man of the house had to get permission from the wife to go or take the family. It was quite an undertaking and expensive. When the midget arrived, overnight, every quarter-mile track, every high school stadium, every athletic field, sports grounds had the capability of becoming a midget racetrack, and hundreds of them did. Now the man of the house could go to work, come home, have dinner, go downtown to see the midgets, and come home at a reasonable hour. So what happened? The midgets brought racing to the people for the very first time. The people didn't have to go to the races. And that was a monumental step forward for the motorsport.
When we return, Hinchliffe Stadium and a walk into history. For the first time in 55 years, Chris visits the former hotbed of New Jersey midget racing. It was there that Economaki first met stock car visionary Bill France Sr. and got a job that changed his life.
Now before it's too late.
In the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, Hinchliffe Stadium in Paterson is listed as home to the New York Black Yankees of baseball's Negro National League, a high school sports stadium, a boxing arena, and a midget auto racetrack.
When was the last time you walked through this gate?
1951, I think, yeah.
55 years ago.
Thereabouts, yeah.
And you haven't been back since?
No, I mean, in fact, the wall, oh no, there it is. I thought it was gone. It's still there.
This was the racetrack.
Right. This was turn 1 of the racetrack here. It was a lot smoother then. What a distressing look. This has got to be the graffiti capital of the eastern United States. Incredible. Seats 10,000 people, and night after night was packed for midget racing. Tuesday and Friday nights, and great racing. What a distressing look this is now. Sad, really sad. And in 1950, I knelt down in this infield with Bill France. I had started to become known as an announcer, and Bill France wanted me to come to Daytona, and we knelt down on the grass.
Let's clarify why you weren't kneeling at the feet of Bill France.
Because we didn't want to have the obstructive view of the people.
That's
if
right.
you stand up, people can't see through you. So we squatted down to give the people in the grandstands a chance to see the whole racetrack.
You and Bill France meeting for the first time.
Right.
For what purpose?
He was going to hire me to come to Daytona and be the track announcer at the beach, on the beach road course.
What did you know about Bill France at that point?
Well, he'd gotten some publicity in the racing community because of his formation of NASCAR.
Okay.
NASCAR was 2 years old at the time, 2.5 years old at the time, and he was trying to build it, and he wanted somebody that knew how to sell the sport to the people in the grandstands.
So how much was Bill France going to pay you to come down and do?
Oh, well, that was a big part of the deal. He guaranteed me 3 days, successive days of announcing at $50 a day. That's $150 for the weekend, and all I had to do was drive 1,300 miles each way, pay the gas, pay my meals, and pay my motel room. And you know what? It covered all the costs. I came home with a few bucks. Well, those were the great days, yeah. It wasn't done for the money. I had never been to Florida before. I wanted to see the world.
How old were you then?
In 1950, I was 30.
30 years old.
And I traveled a lot, and I knew the racing business pretty well. The one thing I'm going to have to study up on is the graffiti business. I can't get over this place. It's incredible.
So you came here as a spectator.
Exactly, and as a reporter for the newspaper, National Speed Sport News. These were important races. These races here attracted drivers from all over the country. Californians came here to race. The great driver from Chicago came here to race. And it was great for publicity. The guy said, well, for Friday night's races, so-and-so, the champion from Kansas City, is going to join the field, and that kind of stuff. And it helped fill up the grandstands.
The stats support Chris's view of midget racing's importance. At the peak, there were 1,000 midget tracks nationwide. And the biggest events, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, drew more than 50,000 fans. It was a phenomenal period in American racing, but it didn't last long. There was this incredible midget era, as you described it.
That's
Perhaps the most important development in American auto racing, I think you've called it. What happened? Where did it go?
Every car was homemade. And some guy that had a toolbox would go and look at and admire some of the craftsmanship. See, this guy made this thing. It's beautiful. And then in the late 40s, Curtis Craft, a company in California, started making production model midgets that were infinitely adjustable. They were superb machines. They were faster than the homemade midgets. It's too fast. In fact, so fast that you couldn't pass anybody. And secondly, they all looked alike. You see, each midget before that Curtis Craft had a different look to it. Some cars had a flared cowling, some cars had a straight hood. The Curtis Crafts were all the same. And so the midget racing became a high-speed dress parade, and the people stopped buying tickets.
Really?
And the midgets went away and replaced by stock cars.
Over how long a span of time from the introduction of the Curtis midget?
About 3 years.
Really?
Before it killed midget racing, yeah. It was too bad. Beautiful machine, but nobody wanted to watch it. They wanted to see passing, and they wanted to see some of the cars that reflected some guy's design thinking, and all the Curtises were the same.
With that, a commercial break, and then surprise answers to two must-ask questions. The best driver and most memorable race Chris Economaki has ever seen. Stay tuned for more on this special edition of Wind Tunnel presented by CarQuest.
Talk to your doctor about Nexium.
Speed joins the racing community in mourning the loss of Chris Economaki, known as the Dean of American Motorsports Journalism. Economaki died earlier today. He was synonymous with his publication, National Speed Sport News. In tribute, we return you to a Wind Tunnel special from 2006, Economaki, Eyewitness to American Racing History.
At a time when the sport desperately needed characters, he painted pictures of the people who drove the cars, who prepared the cars, who promoted the races. And we got to meet some very fascinating people through Chris Economaki's tales.
You have seen in action everybody, every driver that any contemporary race fan could name, and many, many more. And of those, am I correct that you identify a midget racer as the best you ever saw?
Yeah, well, of course, he later on became a big car racer. That's correct. Bob Swanson from Los Angeles was the finest race driver I ever saw, button a crash helmet. No question about that.
Why?
Well, he understood the car, he understood the track, he understood the rivals, he understood his tires, he understood his engine, he knew what he could do and he knew what he couldn't do, and he did it well.
Better than anybody, better than Foyt, better than Andretti.
Let me give you an example of Bob Swanson's ability. In 1936, he was an accomplished midget racing driver. The Vanderbilt Cup race was programmed at Roosevelt Raceway on Long Island. It was a zigzag or pretzel-shaped road course with too many turns. The Europeans all came with their Alfa Romeos and Maseratis and British ERAs and everything. And a California car builder who was famous for his midgets, named Danny Hogan, built a car for that race, and Swanson drove it. Well, it couldn't match the straightaways. He didn't have the right kind of transmission. But in the turns, he would pass Tazio Nuvolari, who won the race.
Nuvolari versus Swanson.
Bob Swanson would go by Tazio Nuvolari's Alfa Romeo in the corners, and Nuvolari would overtake Swanson, and it would happen over and over again. And when the race was over, Tazio Nuvolari, the famous Italian who won the race, sought out Swanson to tell him that he was the finest driver he had ever encountered on a racetrack in his career, which is quite a testament, I think, to Swanson's greatness. The U.S. visit to Monza, Italy in '57 and '58, where I was the English-speaking announcer, was an incredible day of motorsport, both days. You could see there, watch the Europeans marvel at the American drivers' competitiveness and so forth. That sticks in my mind because there's a certain degree of patriotism involved there, just because the Europeans up to that point had always looked down on American racing in this country because it was oval tracks and, you know, that's not real racing. Road courses are the answer. But when the Americans showed up at Monza and the Europeans couldn't hold a candle to their abilities, it made it a good race, it really did. And some of the things that happened there were so memorable. For example, Jim Rathman won the last race there, and Alec Ullman, who was the promoter at Sebring, he was very internationally connected, and he was involved in the officiating crew there for some unknown reason. And he had a friend whose name was John Bouse, an obnoxious guy. And he was standing down there on pit lane with a checkered flag, and Rathman wins the race, and he's coasting towards standing. Of course, what nobody knows is he didn't have any brakes. And so Bouse is standing out there telling him to stop, and Rathman runs into him, knocks him ass over tea kettle down the track, and he's stretched out on the track. Rathman gets out of the car, rushes up, not commiserating with him about it. He says, "You dumb son of a bitch, what do you stand in front of a racing car for that has no brakes?" And he's lying on the track. I'll never forget that episode. It was the closing episode of American racing at Monza. Was the winner of the last race giving hell to some dumb executive who didn't know how to get out of the way.
And there are more great stories to come, including my favorite about AJ and Economaki's role as a pioneer in motorsports television. Stay tuned for more of this special edition of Wind Tunnel presented by CarQuest.
We are at war. We need a team. Let's do a head count. A super soldier, the demigod, a couple of master assassins, and there's me. I have an army. We have a Hulk. Yeah.
When he wants to talk to you about something, you can hear him because it's like, Tony, what do you think about this? And whatever the topic is, and then if you keep him there 5 minutes and he gets into a story, you're probably going to be there 35 minutes. I remember being at Flemington and it was 72 degrees. The barometric pressure was 63.7, and I was about $1.50 short at the pit gate of getting in, and somebody gave me a $5 bill, and two guys flipped over the guardrail. One burnt, cut off his little finger, and he came back, put a tie strap around it, and finished the main event later that evening. Finished third. And that's just stories that he's got all day long. So he's just cool.
What do you think of Tony Stewart?
Tony Stewart, to me, is the ultimate professional driver. He grew up in open-wheel cars, which are much more difficult to master than a stock car. And he took that talent to stock car racing. He knows tracks, he knows cars. Stewart is the consummate American racing driver in my book. To me, the underlying problems NASCAR is facing now is the incredible cost of taking part. You know, the advent of technology has raised the cost of today's racing machine to astronomical levels. You need a special racing car for this, for that, the next thing. Many of NASCAR's top teams have 20 cars for each driver. That's expensive. Was it 43 cars in each Nextel Cup race, 43 cars in East Bush race. Each one of those cars needs several $1 million in sponsorship. It's not out there. That's the problem. The cost of taking part in racing today is so high that you have to have sponsorship. And what that tells you is that automobile racing in today's world is a colossal charity case. And there's not enough givers out there. That's the problem. When NASCAR began, each team had one car. I can remember the day that somebody brought 2 cars to a track. It was the talk of the pits. Mario Andretti and A.J. Foyt will always stand out. They're both great drivers, and they both wanted to outdo the other guy, and they didn't particularly care for one another. They shake hands and say hi when they see one another, but they don't go to dinner together.
Which one's the better driver?
It depends on the day and the track and the car. Yeah. Really.
Yeah. So there wasn't much to choose between the two in terms of just ability to drive?
Foyt is one of the luckiest guys in motorsport. And Mario, unfortunately, is one of the unluckiest guys in motorsport. Mario won the World Driving Championship, and A.J. Foyt won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And somebody's going to try to decide which of those 2 triumphs is paramount, you know. Mario Andretti tried until very recently to win at Le Mans so he could claim superiority over A.J. Foyt.
What does it take, what will it take, or can this happen, to return the Indy 500 to its former, maybe you would argue that it's still there, to its former greatness?
I think the prevalence of American drivers. There are too few American drivers. The Indy Racing League needs to embark on a diversity program to bring in more American drivers.
Count on Economaki to bring a little perspective to the day's racing issues. We'll have a whole lot more of that kind of thing when Wind Tunnel, presented by CarQuest, continues. Chris's long-awaited autobiography is now available, and I'm betting he'd like it if I told you you can order it through the pages of National Speed Sport News. Forget everything else this guy has done. If you only consider Chris Economaki's television career, he is one of the most influential people in the history of American motorsport. Not quite from the first racing telecast, but very close. Chris was there. And for serious race fans, the thing he brought to the table was credibility. Sure, the other announcers had lots more TV experience, but Economaki knew what he was talking about, actually knew the racing game. Let's hear how that all began.
I was a racetrack announcer, and I was a track announcer at the Daytona Speedway. And in 1961, when Wide World of Sports was formed by ABC, they wanted to do the July 4th Firecracker 250. And the management of the track was upset with television. It had been there a year before for a day of racing tailored for TV, and the reviews were miserable. And so the first response to ABC was, you go on back to New York, you messed things up here last year. And ABC said, no, that was another network. We're ABC. Said, you guys in New York are all the same. Don't bother me. But they persisted. And
now, track management would have been Mr. France.
Yeah, Mr. France.
And the other network would have been CBS.
That's correct.
Who sent some lightweight named Walter Cronkite.
The greatest criticism I've ever heard of an announcer was what Bill France said about the announcers on that CBS show in the middle Sunday of 1960 Speed Weeks. And they asked him what was wrong with the show. And he said the announcers did not know which way the cars went. Which I thought was an incredible put down. Anyway, I suspect maybe ABC raised the price a little bit. And so they said, well, what can we do to make you agree to let us televise this event? Well, you get an announcer that knows which way the cars go. And so that was me, and I got pushed onto ABC, and then my first telecast was on July 4th, 1961, at the Firecracker 250 race in Daytona, and that began a career that lasted for 34 years on television. It was a big day for me.
Your early television career produced what I think is one of the funniest interview stories ever. Your interview with A.J. Foyt at Sacramento in 1964?
Yes, 1964, yeah.
Tell me the short version.
You don't really want to hear that.
Oh, sure I do.
The producer was new, and Roone Arledge had told him not to come back from Sacramento without an A.J. Foyt interview. This was late in the season. Foyt had won in Indianapolis and almost every other race. Foyt was virtually unbeatable. And anyway, you finally get to the track, and Foyt's there, and the guy says, I want you to interview Foyt right away. I said, no. I said, he got to go around the track a little bit, get an idea of what the circumstances are like. Chris, you know, all right, you say so, but we've got to have this interview. I said, okay. And so Foyt goes out in his car and comes back in, and I went over to him and I said, are you busy? He said, no. So I said, I got Foyt and all this. Okay, Chris has got Foyt. Let's get the camera, stand by.
Everything
okay.
stops.
Yeah,
this is the big
excitement.
moment.
And I said, AJ, it's a 1 mile dirt track. And I said, notice you walked around the track before you got in your car. What do you learn by walking around the track? He said, well, Chris, he says, I can't take a shit in the morning. I've had a good long walk. So the producer about died when he heard that, because that was going to be the Foyt interview he brought back. Then I took a beat and continued on with something a little bit more palatable.
Tell me about the time that you took your broadcast colleague, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, Jackie Stewart, to the sprint car race.
Well, we were in California for a race at Riverside, and on Saturday night, Jackie was wondering about these races he heard about at Ascot Park, and so I took him over there. And we walked through the pits, and he's looking at these sprint cars. He kept shaking his head in the negative. He couldn't understand why guys would drive these dangerous things. And we walked past A.J. Watson's pit, and A.J. says, hey, Jackie, I got an open cockpit here. You want to drive? And Jackie says in his Scottish brogue, he says, I left me helmet in Riverside. And he says, well, we got a helmet. He says, I left me balls there, too.
but
I always remember that, yeah.
Okay, let's be fair. Jackie, you got a Chris story?
The best one was when he was demonstrating the difference between alcohol and gasoline at Indianapolis, and he had a little ashet of both products, and he set light to them. You could see the flame in the gasoline, but you couldn't see the flame in the alcohol. They put them out, they thought they had, but the alcohol fire stayed on, and Chris walked into it with his double-neck polyester pants on. And of course, he was jumping around like a man wild. All those people watching didn't know. I knew what had happened, and he was in fire. I grabbed an old racing suit, wrapped it round his legs. I'm down in front of him on my knees, putting the fire out. Nobody knew. And then he started to undo his belt. And I thought, oh my God, wait till somebody gets this picture.
I'd pay for a copy of that picture. All right, Ekonomaki, you've told a lot of stories, you've worn a lot of hats, you've played a lot of roles. Of all the things you've done, what's your favorite?
Well, I'm a food and wine guy, so I enjoyed doing the Formula One series all over the world in the first-class restaurants. The deals I always made with television included eating and drinking. And so I was in France and Italy and Japan and Australia. It was a gustatorial delight for me.
Gustatorial delight indeed. Words matter to those of us who make our living with them, and Chris has always been fond of the big ones. When we come back with this special edition of Wind Tunnel presented by CarQuest, my favorite example of how Ekonomaki can take racing's big picture and boil it down to a few well-chosen words.
Wind Tunnel with Dave Despain is presented by the 3,400 CarQuest Auto Parts stores across North America. CarQuest, the professional choice. Brought to you in part by Suzuki, introducing the new Grand Vitara, the authentic SUV. And by Denso Iridium Power Spark Plugs for improved horsepower and better fuel economy on any vehicle street to strip.
The future of motorsports entertainment.
He's an icon. That's what I think he is. He's in his own way in this sport. Chris Ekonomaki is truly an icon.
He's in a league by himself. Always was.
He's the one that wrote the style book that to this day we should aspire to.
There are few people in motorsports that I respect more than Chris. I respect him for his dedication to the game. I respect him for the contribution that he makes. And more than that, for being a friend.
If there's ever a guy who lived it all the way to the end, I'm pretty sure that's going to be Chris Ekonomaki.
And with that, time for one last passage from our long conversation with Chris. And I chose this one because it typifies not only his depth of knowledge, but also his profound understanding of the history of racing in America. After all, he was there, not just observing, but taking part.
Auto racing from the early 1920s through the early to mid-50s was the salvation of the agricultural fair in this country. The county fair, the state fair, the regional fair, all had an auto race day, which was always the biggest day of the fair. And the money the auto race day made these fairs allowed them to start the following year again. So the auto race was very important to the agricultural fair. That's the connection there.
What was the importance of the agricultural fair to auto racing?
It was a place to go strut your stuff and make some money. The agricultural fair was the highlight of the race car owner's season. He could race in March and April and for low money or maybe not get paid at all, but when the fair season began, that's when the money started to roll in.
I have heard, little birds have whispered in my ear, that in the heyday of racing at the agricultural fair, a guy named Chris Ekonomaki was the absolute best at convincing the people on the midway that they should come into the grandstand and buy a ticket. Is that true?
Well, I don't know how good I was, but that was my job. You know, a promotion, worked for a promoter. And, you know, the race promoter's financial return was dependent on the deal he struck with the fair. And a big fair, where a smart guy at the top would never let the promoter on the front gate, if you know what I'm talking about. A manager of a small fair that didn't know too much about business, he did it as a part-time job, he would give the promoter 50% of all the admissions that came out of the grounds that day.
Not out of the grandstand, but out of the grounds.
The sharp guy would say, I'm not letting you on my front gate. You can get 100% of the grandstand. This is after the person has bought their ticket to get out of the grounds. So in order for us to make any money, people had to go to the grandstand. And I did the bally on that.
The bally?
Oh, that's a carnival term for ballyhoo, the chit-chat on the midway that gets people to go to the ticket window.
Give me an example. What are you talking about?
Okay. Attention on the grounds, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the last day of this great agricultural exposition that is the Midland Park County Fair. It's auto race day. Daredevils from coast to coast are here with their high-speed machines facing death at every turn. The box office is now open. That noise you hear is practice. It's just, up, get that driver out from under that burning car. Please excuse me, folks, it's only practice. Get to the grandstand now. The races begin in a half an hour. That's bally.
Bally, courtesy of Chris Ekonomaki, which reminds me that getting the public interested and involved in racing by whatever means is one of the keys to this man's impact on our sport. Think about his definition of the importance of the midget boom. It brought racing to the people. Think about his approach to TV broadcasting, always true to the diehard fan, but at the same time, welcoming to the newcomer. He is an expert who goes out of his way on behalf of the novice, always searching for that spark that might ignite in someone else the same passion for racing that he has felt for more than 7 decades. I think Raleigh Helmling put it pretty well. Every single person involved in racing today owes something to Ekonomaki. So on behalf of us all, I'll say simply, thanks, Chris. But don't for a minute think we've heard the last from this guy, that he's headed out to pasture at the tender age of 85. As always, We'll let Chris have the last word.
Very few of us in life get to make their living at something that started as their hobby. And that's been the case with me. But as a consequence, you give it more. You throw much more into it because of those circumstances. And that's been the case with me. I just love what I do, and I'm prepared to work overtime at it.
Are you seriously considering retirement at age 85?
I'm trying to retire, and it's very difficult. I don't have the right years for retiring.
We hope you enjoyed Speed's presentation of a wind tunnel special report from 2006. Ekonomaki, eyewitness to American racing history. Chris Ekonomaki died earlier today. The New Jersey native brought motorsports into the mainstream through his TV reporting and his paper, National Speed Sport News. For more on his legacy, go to speed.com.